You carry a particular kind of silence that most people will never understand. It's the silence that comes after you've answered the question, "So, are you close with your family?" and watch the atmosphere shift, the micro expression of confusion, the polite nod that doesn't quite reach their eyes, the unspoken judgment that hangs in the air like smoke. You've learned to navigate this moment with practiced efficiency, a vague smile, a deflection, a quick pivot to safer conversational territory, because you know that the truth, the real truth, is too complex, too heavy, too threatening to the social contract that says family is everything, family is sacred, family is the one relationship you're never supposed to walk away from. But you did walk away. And here's what no one tells you about that decision. The thing that saved your life is the same thing that now haunts it. You chose yourself, you chose safety. You chose sanity over the mythology of unconditional love. And in doing so, you entered into a psychological territory that our culture has no map for, a space where survival and grief occupy the same coordinates, where liberation and loss are the same experience, where the very act of healing requires you to carry a wound that most people refuse to acknowledge exists. This is the core paradox of family estrangement. You had to leave to stay alive, but leaving meant severing the attachment that your nervous system was biologically wired to protect at all costs. You became the villain in someone else's story so you could finally become the protagonist in your own. You traded the certainty of dysfunction for the uncertainty of freedom. And now you exist in this liminal space, not quite an orphan, not quite connected, forever explaining a loss that you yourself initiated, forever justifying a grief that you paradoxically chose. The psychological complexity here is staggering, because unlike other forms of loss, death, divorce, geographic distance, estrangement is an act of agency. It's a declaration, it's a line drawn in permanent ink, and that active choice means you're denied the social permission to mourn. You're denied the casseroles and condolence cards. You're denied the cultural scripts that allow people to process relational death. Instead, you're met with suspicion, with the subtle accusation that you must be the problem, because good people don't abandon family, healthy people work it out, normal people forgive. Except you did try, for years, maybe decades. You tried to be smaller, quieter, more accommodating. You tried to translate your needs into a language they could hear. You tried to build bridges across chasms they refused to acknowledge existed. And eventually, finally, you realized that you weren't abandoning them, you were rescuing yourself. But even now, years later, you still feel the phantom weight of it. The grief that has no name, the loss that has no funeral, the family you mourn while they're still alive. Let's establish the foundation here, because estrangement isn't just a choice. It's a complex psychological process shaped by developmental trauma, attachment disruption, and nervous system survival. From a clinical perspective, what we're discussing is relational severance as self-preservation, the conscious decision to terminate contact with family of origin due to patterns of abuse, neglect, enmeshment, or systemic dysfunction that pose a threat to psychological integrity. The people who make this decision typically share a common history. They grew up in environments characterized by what psychologists call invalidating family environments, systems where emotional expression was punished, reality was consistently denied, and the child's subjective experience was systematically erased. Marsha Linehan, who developed dialectical behavior therapy, identified this as a core contributor to complex relational trauma. Think of it like this: imagine your nervous system as a smoke detector. In a healthy home, the detector goes off when there's actual fire. You learn to trust the alarm, but in a dysfunctional family system, the detector goes off constantly for minor infractions, for existing too loudly, for having needs. Eventually, you learn that the detector is the problem, not the fire. You learn to override your own alarm system. You learn that your perception of danger is too sensitive, dramatic, ungrateful. This creates what psychologists call dissociative attachment patterns. You remain physically present but emotionally evacuated. You learn to perform the role of family member while your authentic self goes underground, into hiding, into exile within your own body. The neuroscience here is crucial. Dr. Bessel van der Kolk, in his groundbreaking work on trauma, explains that chronic relational threat during development actually reshapes the architecture of the brain. Your amygdala, the threat detection center, becomes hyperactive and overresponsive. Your prefrontal cortex, the part responsible for rational assessment, becomes underactive. Your vagus nerve, the highway of the parasympathetic nervous system, learns to stay in a state of perpetual guardedness. You don't just remember the dysfunction, you embody it, it becomes your baseline. This is where the concept of complex PTSD becomes relevant. Unlike single-incident trauma, CPTSD emerges from prolonged, repeated relational violation, usually in childhood, usually by caregivers. The symptoms aren't just flashbacks and hypervigilance, they're difficulties with emotional regulation, chronic shame, a fractured sense of self. And crucially, what psychologist Pete Walker calls toxic loyalty, the compulsion to protect and excuse the very people who harmed you, even at the expense of your own well-being. Breaking that loyalty, choosing estrangement, requires something that our psychological framework doesn't adequately honor. It requires you to commit what feels like a form of psychological patricide. You must kill the fantasy of the family you deserved in order to accept the reality of the family you had. You must grieve the parents who never existed while setting boundaries with the ones who do. And this is where the extended metaphor becomes essential. Estrangement is not divorce. It's more like amputation. You don't remove a limb because you hate it, you remove it because it's threatening the life of the whole organism. The limb may have been infected by gangrene or crushed beyond repair or consuming resources that the body can't afford to lose. The removal is not vengeful, it's medical, it's triage. But even after amputation, the phantom limb remains. You still feel it, you still reach for it. Your nervous system still sends signals to tissue that no longer exists, and everyone around you expects you to get over it because the danger is gone, the wound is closed, the chapter is finished. Except it's not finished because you didn't just lose the bad parts. You lost the mythology, you lost the hope, you lost the possibility that things could change, you lost the dream of reconciliation, the fantasy of being seen, the chance that they might one day say, "You were right, we were wrong, we're sorry." And that is the loss that most people refuse to validate. Here is the truth that our culture finds too uncomfortable to speak aloud. Choosing yourself over family requires a kind of courage that borders on the existential. Because family is supposed to be the one place you don't have to earn belonging. It's supposed to be the one relationship built on unconditional foundation. It's the original template for what love means, what safety feels like, what home is. And when that template is broken, when family becomes the source of harm rather than healing, you're not just leaving a relationship, you're leaving the primary mythology of human existence. Carl Jung wrote extensively about the concept of individuation, the psychological process of becoming a separate, whole self distinct from the collective. For Jung, this was the central task of human development, but he also acknowledged that individuation comes at a cost. It requires you to betray the tribe, to disappoint the ancestors, to step outside the circle of collective identity and say, "I am not you, I will not carry what you carried. I will not repeat what you repeated." This is what family estrangement truly is. It's an act of individuation so radical that it severs the umbilical cord entirely. And the grief is enormous, because you're not just mourning the people. You're mourning the belonging. You're mourning the holidays that will never feel uncomplicated again. You're mourning the shared history, the inside jokes, the collective memory that gives life a sense of continuity. You're mourning the version of yourself who believed that if you just tried harder, loved better, gave more, they would finally see you. The invisible grief of estrangement is the grief of a loss that everyone else can still see walking around. They're alive, they're functioning, they're telling their version of the story, the one where you're the ungrateful child, the cold one, the one who abandoned them. And you have no rebuttal that won't sound defensive, no evidence that won't seem petty, no justification that won't require you to betray confidences or expose wounds that are still too tender to speak aloud. So you carry it quietly. You carry the grief of the mother who never protected you, the father who never saw you, the siblings who chose sides or stayed silent. You carry the weight of every holiday you'll spend constructing chosen family because blood family is no longer safe. You carry the exhaustion of explaining over and over that no, you're not being dramatic. No, you haven't tried therapy together. Yes, you're sure. Yes, it's permanent. And beneath all of that, you carry the most painful truth of all. You sacrificed belonging for selfhood. You chose to exist over being loved. You chose truth over peace. You chose your future over their past. And in our culture, which worships at the altar of family above all else, that choice is treated as a moral failure rather than an act of profound self-preservation. The philosopher Kierkegaard spoke of the concept of anxiety of freedom, the existential dread that comes from realizing that you are responsible for creating your own meaning in a world without inherent structure. This is what estrangement forces upon you. You must become the author of your own life without the safety net of familial approval. You must define goodness, worth, and belonging for yourself without the external validation that says, "You are one of us." It's terrifying, it's lonely, and it's the most honest thing you've ever done. Because here's what they don't tell you: staying would have killed you. Maybe not physically, though sometimes even that, but spiritually, psychologically. The death would have been slower, quieter, more socially acceptable. You would have kept performing, kept shrinking, kept pretending that the pain wasn't real, that the harm wasn't happening, that love was supposed to feel like walking on glass. Leaving wasn't cruelty, it was survival. But survival comes with a price, and that price is the eternal question that haunts the back of your mind, especially at 3 a.m. when the defenses are down. Am I the villain? Let's talk about what this decision looks like in your adult life, because estrangement doesn't end when you cut contact. It reverberates through every relationship, every choice, every quiet moment when you're forced to reckon with what you've done. You might find that you're hyper-independent to the point of isolation. You've learned that asking for help is dangerous, that needing someone gives them power, that vulnerability is a weapon that will inevitably be used against you. So you build your life like a fortress, self-sufficient, self-reliant, self-contained, and you tell yourself it's strength, but really it's just the logical extension of a nervous system that learned that connection equals threat. You might struggle with the concept of chosen family in ways that surprise you. Everyone tells you to build community, to create family from friends, to find your tribe. But there's a part of you that doesn't believe it's real, because if blood, the most supposedly permanent bond, can be revoked, then what's to stop chosen family from doing the same? You wait for the other shoe to drop, you test people, you create small crises to see if they'll stay. And when they do stay, you don't feel relief, you feel confusion, suspicion. What do they want from me? You might experience what therapists call anniversary reactions, emotional flooding around holidays, birthdays, family-centric events. While everyone else is posting pictures of Thanksgiving dinner or Christmas morning, you're navigating the minefield of well-meaning questions, going home for the holidays, and you have to decide in real time how much to reveal. Do you lie, deflect, tell the abbreviated truth, and watch their face change? Each year the grief returns like clockwork, and each year you're expected to have moved on by now. You might find yourself unconsciously drawn to relationships with unavailable or emotionally distant people, because dysfunction is familiar, because chaos feels like home, because part of you is still trying to win the love you didn't get from your family by finally earning it from someone else who withholds it. This is called repetition compulsion, the unconscious drive to recreate the original wound in hopes of a different outcome. You're not attracted to healthy love because healthy love doesn't speak the language your nervous system learned. You might struggle with an internal voice that constantly questions your reality. Did it really happen the way you remember? Were you too sensitive? Are you being unfair? This is the internalized voice of the invalidating environment still functioning inside your own mind. Psychologists call it cognitive dissonance, the discomfort of holding two contradictory beliefs simultaneously. I had to leave for my safety versus good people don't abandon family. You oscillate between certainty and doubt, and the exhaustion of that internal argument is invisible to everyone around you. You might experience what I call existential homelessness, a sense that you don't fully belong anywhere because you've severed the root system. You're not from where you came from anymore, but you're also not entirely comfortable in the present you've built. You exist in permanent diaspora from your own origin story, and there's no geographic return, no reconciliation that will restore what was lost. You're perpetually between worlds, the one you left and the one you're still building. You might find that you overfunction in all other relationships as compensation for the one you failed to save. You become the reliable friend, the therapist of your friend group, the one who always shows up, always remembers, always gives. Because if you can prove your worthiness everywhere else, maybe you can quiet the voice that says the estrangement happened because you weren't enough. This is compensatory perfectionism, trying to earn love through performance because you couldn't secure it through simple existence. Here's what you need to understand: these aren't personality flaws, they're coping strategies. They're the brilliant, creative adaptations your nervous system invented to keep you alive in an environment where love was conditional and safety was uncertain. But adaptations that saved you in childhood often sabotage you in adulthood. The hypervigilance that protected you from sudden outbursts now prevents you from relaxing into intimacy. The independence that kept you safe from disappointment now isolates you from support. The skepticism that helped you see through manipulation now prevents you from trusting genuine care. And the work, the real, excruciating work, is learning to witness these patterns without judgment, not to gaslight yourself with positivity, not to shame yourself for still struggling years later, but to simply see it, to name it, to say, this is what I learned to do to survive. It made sense then, it doesn't make sense now, and I get to choose differently. The estrangement itself isn't the problem. The estrangement was the solution. What you're dealing with now is the aftermath, the rewiring, the slow, patient work of teaching your nervous system that you're not there anymore, that the threat has passed, that you can put the armor down. Not because you're safe from all harm, you're not. but because you're no longer trapped in a system designed to deny your reality. You're free, and freedom, paradoxically, is what allows the grief to finally surface. So where do you go from here? How do you heal a wound that has no socially sanctioned space for healing? How do you grieve a loss that everyone tells you isn't real? How do you build a life on the other side of a decision that required you to betray every message you ever received about loyalty, forgiveness, and family? The answer is both simple and extraordinarily difficult. You reparent yourself. You become for yourself what they could not be for you. This is the work of internal family systems therapy, of inner child reparenting, of what Jungians call shadow integration. It's the practice of going back to the younger versions of yourself, the child who needed protection, the teenager who needed validation, the young adult who needed permission, and offering them what the adults in your life couldn't give. This isn't metaphor, this is neuroscience. When you visualize speaking to your younger self with compassion, when you offer yourself the validation that was withheld, your brain begins to create new neural pathways. You're literally rewiring the attachment template that was established in childhood. You're proving to your nervous system that care is possible, that you are worthy of gentleness, that your needs are not too much. And this work requires fierce commitment, because our culture will constantly try to pull you back toward reconciliation, toward forgiveness that you haven't chosen, toward the idea that healing means letting them back in. But healing doesn't require their participation. Healing doesn't require their apology. Healing doesn't require their acknowledgement of the harm. Healing requires you to tell the truth to yourself about what actually happened. It requires what psychologist Alice Miller called enlightened witnessing, the practice of standing beside your own experience without minimization, without excuse-making, without prematurely rushing to forgiveness that absolves them and erases you. The Buddhist teacher Pema Chodron speaks about the concept of Shenpa, the Tibetan word for the charge, the hook, the trigger that pulls you back into old patterns. Healing is learning to feel the Shenpa without reacting to it. To notice when the old voices arise, you're being selfish, you're being cruel, you should try one more time, and to simply acknowledge them without obedience. I hear you, and I'm still choosing myself. One of the most powerful tools in this process is boundary as prayer, reframing your decision not as punishment, but as devotion. Devotion to your own well-being, devotion to the life you're building, devotion to the version of yourself who deserves to exist without constant threat. The estrangement is not a wall, it's a membrane. It's the necessary boundary that allows you to finally, for the first time, discover who you are when you're not busy managing their emotions, anticipating their reactions, or performing the role of the child they needed you to be. And in that space, that quiet, uncertain, often lonely space, something miraculous begins to happen. You start to meet yourself. Not the self that was shaped by their expectations, not the self that learned to disappear to keep the peace, but the self that exists beneath all the adaptations, the self that has opinions, preferences, desires, the self that laughs differently, rests differently, loves differently than the family system allowed. This is what Jung meant when he said, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. Estrangement is the price you paid for that privilege. And yes, it's unfair that you had to pay it. It's unfair that others get to take family for granted while you had to earn your own freedom through exile. It's unfair that your healing looks like loss while other people's healing looks like reunion. But fairness is not the metric here. Survival is, authenticity is, the capacity to live in alignment with your own truth rather than in service to their comfort. And maybe, just maybe, years from now, you'll look back on this decision not with regret, but with gratitude. Not because the loss doesn't still ache, but because you'll see what you gained: your life, yourself, your sovereignty. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche wrote, "No price is too high to pay for the privilege of owning yourself." You paid that price, and you're still here. Still breathing, still building, still becoming. The estrangement doesn't define you, it freed you to define yourself. And that is the legacy of this decision, not the family you lost, but the self you found. Not the belonging you sacrificed, but the integrity you chose. Not the wound you carry, but the courage it took to say, I matter, my pain matters, my reality matters. You are not broken for leaving, you are whole because you stayed loyal to your own truth. If this resonated with you, if you see yourself in this story, know that you're not alone. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe if you want more conversations about the psychology of survival, the complexity of healing, and the quiet courage it takes to choose yourself. And remember, the goal was never to be fixed. The goal was always to be free.